Good afternoon and welcome to session one. It's a privilege to open the day's discussion. Following on Montek's very sharp keynote, I couldn't find a better word, sharp keynote, and those who know him, and I've known him for pretty long and read almost all that he's written, you have to sort of read between the lines. So, they've given us enough to sort of mull over. But more than that, I think he challenged us, right? The status quo is not going to work, but then how can cooperation be built in a fractured world? And this session and the ones that will follow really tackle this head on. We look at two blockages in session one: institutions built for old crises and debt burdens that defy reason. And over 60 countries, poor, vulnerable, low income, global south, whatever you want to call it, the number is about 60 plus, who are locked into this whole conundrum of lack of affordable capital and the absence of sustainable revenue stream. And they're being forced to choose between debt service, development finance, and building climate resilience. So frankly, for me, this is not a technical glitch. This is a systemic failure of almost whatever year you want to take, Bretton Woods creation, or you want to take subsequently. So our panel today is the bridge on this question. It connects Montek's why, he asked the question why, to the how of the two sessions that will come up. And the two policy leaders who are already here with me on this are Dr. Rakesh Mohan on my extreme left, who has already been introduced as the architect and a pillar of modern India's economic policy setup. I have seen him for almost 4 decades, shaping reforms in India, building institutions, and later on also questioning them in his public writings. Government of India, RBI, IMF, so he's seen the mill, he's seen the inside track, and he's also seen how it looks from outside. So, great pleasure, Rakesh, to have you on this panel. And then we have Dr. Auguste Tano Kouamé, World Bank India Director. He has worked on both sides, creditor and debtor. His lens is global. His lens is a very grounded one, and the little that I know of Auguste, a very clear one. From Washington, D.C. to Côte d'Ivoire, in West Africa, to New Delhi. And Anit reminded me a couple of days back that Côte d'Ivoire is often seen as a fiscal outlier that manages debt responsibly, fiscal matters responsibly, when the neighborhood is struggling. So probably you can bring to bear that experience, so it'll be a pleasure. Format-wise, I'll pose 2 questions, no more, given the time, and give each of you 3 minutes each. I'll then allow you both to powwow with each other for about a minute, and then we'll throw it open to the audience, time permitting. So Rakesh, allow me to begin with you. You know this well, that we are hearing calls for reforms all the time. I think Montek rightly put out that the topics that we are discussing today, what is new? These should have been discussed and concluded some years back. I hope I've got that right, Montek. But I think the call that is relevant to our session is about how to unstick the debt curse. I think that's the one that is coming up again and again. Right now in Washington, D.C., there are almost 35 events taking place where the debt issue is being discussed. This is IMF, World Bank, private, NGOs, civil society, as many as that. And IMF has now come up with data yesterday which says that debt at risk, now they are using debt at risk, not the ratio. So debt at risk, in their view, by 2029 is going to become almost 115% of GDP, global, which is a pretty high number, come to think of it. And let me tie, Rakesh, 3 real-time stressors to this macro picture. We very recently had the bond markets who are very unhappy, and they're aggressively speaking out, and a lot of people are worried about it because this is public debt. Yields are rising, fiscal space is contracting, trade finance is weakening, and we have had the whole reciprocal tariff and shifting capital flows and so on. Now, these three forces are being designed in this city, all the three stressors, as I call it. But interestingly, their application is pretty universal. It applies to poor countries as much as they're applied to the United States. So the question with this little preamble, Rakesh, is the following. That is the current debt architecture, and you can make it the global finance architecture, forcing the impossible choices for countries, liquidity versus investment, debt service versus building resilience, without unlocking the structural bind that they had inherited. For most of these countries, that stock is continuing, despite the fact that institutions like the IMF and the World Bank have tried to, unbuckle that. So will these institutions be able to support these countries?
First, thank you very much, Dhruv and Lavish, for getting me here and inviting me to this session. Second, on a lighter note to begin with, I'm glad I'm not in a policy-making position now, which would force me to answer these questions.
You always like to do that, right? Whether you are or you're not.
So, in some sense, these are not new questions, Udaibir. Look, there have been all kinds of debt crises and, constantly in a constant mode of debt crisis solutions, right? So I don't see anything particularly new here, except one thing, which is that I don't think it's been the case, at least maybe post-Depression, or post-Second World War, that it's the developed countries who are the culprits. That is, their debt GDP ratios, whether the United States, with all of Europe, Japan, UK, are mostly above 100%. I've not looked at the data closely, but it's mostly above 100%. So the bond market crises are really for them to be tackling, not telling us what the hell to do, okay? Because they are the culprits. They are causing the problems in the bond market, all right? Now, I'm not saying there's an easy solution to that. I'm not saying that, look, that doesn't cause us problems. Of course it does. But what I'm saying is, I don't know whether the 35 seminars you mentioned, meetings, are talking about that, or they're going on and on about what the hell we are doing, okay? Because we are the victims, and they're the perpetrators. And I'm not in the old third world business, okay? I'm just talking about what's new now. So that's one. Two, whenever interest rates go down, like they did when there was extraordinary monetary policy in the developed world, that the international institutions, World Bank, IMF, etc., go off and persuade developing countries to borrow more externally. Because the rates are so good, why don't you borrow? You're stupid if you don't borrow. Okay? Luckily, we never listen to them. Because India's external, we have high debt, but it's all domestic. Very little external borrowing. Once when I was Reserve Bank's deputy governor, there was huge pressure from investment banks around the world on the finance ministry to do more external borrowing. So in one meeting with the then finance minister, as deputy governor, I said, I don't agree with this. If you do this, you'll have to carry my dead body out of the Reserve Bank. Okay? And luckily, my dead body didn't have to be carried out. So on a serious note, what I'm saying is that the multilateral institutions have to introspect much more on what they have been advising in the past and what to do in the future. Third, one of the things that has, I've not done much work on it, but I've often wondered about is that, particularly this for Africa, because now Asian countries are not doing that much. They're doing borrowing, but not that much from multilaterals. There, of course, we borrow from multilaterals and so on. But my question is this, that have we worked out that to the extent that external aid, whether it's debt or otherwise, how much of a Dutch disease has that been causing in Africa? All right. What do I mean by that? That given that exchange rates in general are relatively market determined, if there's a lot of capital flows coming, particularly through multilaterals as well as bilaterals, all right, I presume that does have an effect of appreciating real exchange rate, which has meant that you are handicapping exports from developing countries forever, which is why they keep getting into debt crisis. So one answer is, well, then you have to fix exchange rates, okay, so that the Dutch disease doesn't occur. And that's an interesting issue on what can you fix, should you fix, in what ways do you fix, or you manage, I don't have a good answer to that. But I think this is an issue that I have not seen much discussed in your 35 seminars here, or otherwise for 3 years I was in the IMF board. Okay, so I think what I'm sort of saying is that we have to, the multilaterals and we, in general, in terms of macro policy makers in developing countries, emerging markets, have to think about some of these issues. That how much external debt can we actually sustain?
Yeah.
All right, and then can't he keep having debt crises? Right. Second, look at the Dutch disease issue.
Yeah.
And third, what that leads to is a better understanding of consistent macro balance policies, which cover fiscal policy, monetary policy, exchange rate policy, and trade policy, because they're all interconnected.
Yeah.
And which then gives us better guidance. Look, how much, if you look at the next 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, how much domestic savings do we need?
Yeah, yeah.
All right?
So
these are all old issues. There's nothing new.
So yeah,
Let me just finish one compliment to Auguste for his country. Actually, I had the privilege, I think it was in January, of being invited to a 2-day meeting in Ivory Coast. Okay. Unfortunately, I was in bed, so I couldn't go, but I participated virtually, and I was very impressed actually that almost the whole cabinet spent 2 full days with the likes of people like me, except that I wasn't there, my colleagues there, I was virtually. And one of the things when I read up for this meeting, I was impressed by the fiscal management in the Ivory Coast.
So, Rakesh, just on the issue with the old issues, it's an old wine in new bottle, which is broken. And the debt landscape today compared to 10 years ago.
The new bottle is the developed countries. Okay? And they filled that bottle with their debt.
So, well,
don't hide, don't escape from that, Udaibir.
So,
people in Washington will avoid talking about that.
No. I think without getting into who's drinking that wine, that's the whole point. Some people say the advanced countries are drinking it. Some say the rest of the non-developed world is drinking it. But I just wanted to say that the debt landscape, just going back, issues are the same. It's just that the landscape is vastly different. Yeah. Would you like to react on the same question and react to what you heard from Rakesh?
Okay. Great.
Yes. Yep.
Thanks, Uday. And I should thank also ORF for inviting me. And really, this is a great opportunity to learn and also share. I think the debt landscape has changed, but quite frankly, it almost feels like we've seen this movie before. So, what are the numbers telling us? There's 62 countries that are either in debt distress or at risk of debt distress. 10 of them are really already in debt distress. Of the 62 countries, 40 of them are in Africa. We saw that movie when we came up with HIPIC. Some of you may remember. And we kind of said, we've solved their problem. The debt has been the debt burden has been reduced. Now they can resume growing again. Well, in the process of growing, we forgot about institutions. We forgot about making sure that this didn't happen again. And then back then, we didn't have climate change. But we have other issues such as health issues, or not pandemic, but real public health issues that forced these countries to go into debt. We had the oil crisis that forced them to go into debt. When they came back to borrow, the market said, "Wow, it's if it happens again, maybe the MDBs, multilateral development banks, or the governments of the world will save them." And the market, opened the door, and many countries, went to the market and borrowed. And now we've seen the debt built up. So we tried to come up with some solutions. We had this common framework that we said, could be useful.
Which is not working well.
It's not working. Why? Because although we've seen the movies before, one thing, Rakesh talked about changes on the borrower side, but on the lender side, things have changed also. The movie now says, well, the lenders are different. China plays a bigger role than before. The private sector plays a bigger role because the market has, was encouraged to lend. So how do you have a common framework when the people who are talking about this common framework are a small part of the debt? The World Bank-IMF, we're not a big part of the stock of debt as before. So we had a lot of conversations, and it didn't go very, very far, right? Then at the World Bank, we said, okay, we'll have this, climate resilient debt clause, in debt arrangements, so that when a country is hit by climate change, which is a new thing, we can allow them to pause on debt service. But that's probably just a small part of the debt service because it is to us. But how about other creditors? And we're now trying to find ways of having conversations in 35 seminars, as I said, but nothing really is emerging as a solution. I think we need to think about a solution at the global level. Now, realizing that this is not happening, we're not giving up at the World Bank. We say, okay, we need to work with countries, individual countries. The drivers of debt are, interest rates, primary deficits, and growth. So if we can act on those through internal reforms, maybe things will be better for individual countries, either in debt or at risk of debt, or preventing good countries from becoming indebted. And that's why, the example that Rakesh mentioned of countries like Cote d'Ivoire who are putting together institutions to make sure that, when you borrow within a given framework, you strengthen your domestic resource mobilization, you have some fiscal rules that, and India is a very good example actually of fiscal rules, including at the state level. So if countries can learn, and then when countries are in good time, encourage them to accumulate more reserves, to have a good cushion. Like India, again, India has a good cushion. So in bad times, it can use the cushion to stabilize the currency. So we're focusing more on domestic reforms, domestic resource mobilization, fiscal management, expenditure management, and hopefully that will help. But I think we need a solution at the global level very soon for the 62 countries at least.
So just as...
One question. Is the US one of those 62 countries?
No.
Seriously.
No.
So I don't.
100%
The short answer is that I don't know, but because I'm more interested in the developing countries in that group.
These 62. It's a different metric. I think just going back, both of you again telling all of us that this is an old movie played many times, and we all have seen it. But that leads me to ask you a question. That alongside, people have tried all kinds of reforms. Just this morning, the IMF has come out with what they call a playbook.
Yes.
Right? Playbook that will guide countries to go for debt restructuring in a smooth, fiscally prudent way that can put them on a sustainable financing path. So from playbooks to movies to whatever, everything is coming, common framework, right? But there's something not gelling, right? What is that? Where is the problem? If you want a global solution, who should own it? Who should lead that? Rakesh's point that leadership is coming largely from those who are now themselves, right? They have no moral high ground to be talking to other countries about debt or fiscal imprudence. So do the MDVs do it?
That's an interesting question. I think, unfortunately, the only answer that comes to mind to me is that yes, the MDBs should do it. The MDBs have to do it, but the challenge is that the MDBs are not big creditors. But so because if the MDBs don't do it, the alternative is that bilateral will do it, but they won't do it.
So you hold a big soft power. You can influence technical
Yes, and that's
knowledge exchange, right?
That brings me back to HIPIC. So HIPIC happened when MDBs, the World Bank and IMF, essentially said we need to do something. Back then we had more leverage because we were a bigger creditor than now in the problem. But we were not the only creditor, so we were able to bring bilaterals on board. Back then there were some frameworks like the Paris Club. There was the consultative groups that for each country every year. So we had that framework that we used. Today, we don't have it, but unfortunately, there is no other solutions than MDB is doing it. So you hear a lot of our leaders talking about it, so maybe something will happen soon. Debt is really delaying development.
Yeah.
It is preventing countries from investing in development. And with that realization, I think MDBs should do it, but then how do we bring China and other creditors to agree on something? There is a problem of transparency. We don't even have full transparency on the debt that is owed to all bilateral creditors. So, if countries agree to be fully transparent on the debt that they have, on the loans they've given to countries, and if borrowers were ready to provide full information, you saw the revision of debt data that happened recently in Senegal.
Yes.
And this was a big gap of almost 25% of GDP. So if countries on both sides, lenders and borrowers, were prepared to give full information, then it will allow us, MDBs, to bring them together and start, finding a solution. The solution could come from, maybe having a global pool of funds, proportionally distributed to the creditors, because if you were part of the problem, you need to have an equal share in the solution. We could do our share perhaps in delaying some debt services in cases that do not require restructuring, because we cannot restructure IBRD debt, for example. So we could find a solution, but we need transparency, we need data, and the common framework basically, fell short of that. Countries were not prepared to give full data and full information.
Rakesh, 30 seconds. Going back to what Auguste just now said.
I can never give an answer.
No,
to any
you have
question in
to.
30
You have to.
seconds.
That's why. Listen, here is a quick one, okay? He said it needs a global solution. Let's assume, just experiment, a global body is set up and you're heading it. Okay, what will be that one thing that you would like to be done today?
No.
Actionable.
See, one thing I learned when I first joined the Reserve Bank was never answer a question. Say what you want.
Okay, so you don't have an answer.
No. Say what you want to be communicated. Okay, and seriously, the point here is that, as Auguste said, that the MDBs are no longer the major creditors. So I think that gives the first answer. You got to assemble who are the major creditors. Okay. And so in some sense, you can't find an answer unless the major creditors are around the table. Whether you form an institution to do that or you take the existing framework, that's one. Two, also...
I wanted one.
No. Also, who are the real debtors, okay? And what I mean by that, once again, I go back, I'm not saying that flippantly, that look, the kind of borrowing that was done during post-COVID by the developed countries, I've not looked at the number, that magnitude must be a multiple of all African countries put together. Okay? So who are the debtors? Right? And then of course, finally, you need to go down more granularly, as again Auguste was saying, that you had a framework for doing that more granular analysis on where are the real issues in terms of developing countries, emerging markets.
Right. Okay.
My guess would be that there are not that many emerging markets who have a problem apart from Argentina. It's either the developed countries or the developing countries.
Public debt, no.
Yeah.
Debt,
Yeah.
broader debt, yes.
Yeah.
They're there.
Yeah.
If you include households and corporates. Auguste, do you have anything before I turn it? I'll ask Montek to also come in this one. What is one thing that you would like, just actionable? You've seen a lot. You've written a lot of reports.
Yeah, I think one thing I would like is for us to remember that whatever the solution is, the money that will be needed to solve the problem is not going to come from another planet. So the money is money that is here already. So we need to agree to use whatever the resources are to solve the problem, and within that, because if I said the second thing, you'll say, no, I just wanted one. But I do have a second thing to say, which is that we need to remember that if we solve the problem, it will contribute to global growth.
Yeah.
It will contribute to growth for everyone. Because we learned that when a country is facing a challenging situation, It can affect neighbors, and it can affect the global economy. It can through economic channel or through demographic and migration channels.
Right.
Or even through health channels. So yes, we need to find the resources for here in on Mother Earth, solve the problem, because the solution will help all of us.
Yeah.
And finally, when we talk about climate finance, because we don't have time to talk about it, when we talk about climate finance and all that, we should be very, very careful not to use that as an excuse for not asking countries that are in debt to be disciplined because they didn't cause the climate problem.
Just to close this. The movie is going on. The movie will go on. This is like that movie for 4 hours.
One suggestion for the future, which is that to the extent that much of the lending is now done by private sources and not by the official sources, both bilateral and multilateral, can there be a possibility of the multilaterals giving interest subsidy? Okay? That is, if it is the case that we evaluate that the borrowing costs of developing countries in developed markets are too high, and we are not doing the financial intermediation, that is the MDBs. So suppose that's 8% for argument's sake, and you feel, well, it'll be okay if it's 5%. You give a 3% subsidy. That'll be much cheaper. Of course, you have to find the right framework for doing it so you don't follow markets.
Right.
Okay? But it'll be much, much cheaper than what we do now. I don't know if that's feasible or not.
Yeah, okay. Dhruva, we need to have another one. Auguste, bad news. The word on the street is that you are the other planet. You meaning the World Bank balance sheet. That you have all the money. I'm going to ask Montek, and please, your intervention. You're here. Yeah, here you are. Okay.
Thank you. I must say this really takes me back to 2001, because I think the nth Argentinian crisis, Anne Krieger had made a proposal in the IMF that the only way you could handle the debt sustainability issue is for countries to agree that the IMF will decide what's the haircut that both the public and the private sector guys have to take, and that the countries would endorse that. And of course, no one was willing to do that, and Wall Street was absolutely appalled at the idea that some bureaucratic international mechanism would decide that bonds honestly bought in New York would now experience a haircut of 20 or 23%. So frankly, as long as you've got a lot of private debt, in fact, today, even if you have public debt, since it's not just the Paris Club, it's also China. Yes. First of all, the public debtors have to agree on what's a reasonable distribution of the burden. I mean, I'm assuming that a serious debt crisis can only be solved by a haircut. And the issue then is who does what haircutting, and how does the private sector get a haircut? And this was tried in 2001, discussed in the IMF board. The major countries were totally opposed to it. The idea that the World Bank will step in and doing this only guarantee antipathy towards the World Bank on the part of a lot of financial. So the bank has a lot of very important things to do. So I would seriously urge that the bank should at best be willing to lend in parallel with the fund, and let the fund handle the issue of debt sustainability. And if they want to handle the issue of debt sustainability, let them issue a staff paper on what went wrong in 2001. So that's 24 years ago.
Do we need
bad
to?
News,
do we
bad
need
news,
to?
Montek. There is no goodwill for the IMF and IMF to play the role.
Do we need to
Common
revisit the? Do we need to revisit the SDRM?
The what?
SDRM.
This was the
sovereign debt
thing of sovereign
again,
debt.
You mentioned sovereign debt restructuring
Okay.
mechanism.
Anne Krieger's proposal.
I've got a brutal, very angry Ankit saying, pause. Okay. They'll have another seminar some other time. Sanjay, do you have any quick comment to make or a question? Oh, you can do it bilaterally.
Montek already sort of, I was going in the same, I was just going to say that the official sector needs to really play a much bigger role in this and not be so shy of doing that. I think that's the important thing.
So MDBs? Or?
Yeah, the MDBs, yeah.
So we are all going to suffer victims of intergenerational debt trap, and we can keep on running the movie probably for lots of generations. Thank you very much. Over to you.